Any other questions? Yes?
What's the name of the film?
The film goes by the name Zen, and it is available on the internet pretty inexpensively now. I had gotten a version, and I'm playing it all the way through, and it starts breaking up, and I realized, hey, this must be a pirated version. And then I ran into somebody who confirmed for me that a pirated version was going around, and so I got a better version that became authorized for sale in the U.S. However, when I wanted to splice this and edit this with some help from my student assistants, it turned out we needed the pirated film because there wasn't any copyright. It was much easier to pick it apart and edit it. So I'm glad I have the two versions there.
You get it from Kimook.com.
Kimook.com, yeah, K-I-M-O-O-K is one of the distributors of Asian films that has carried that. That's where I got the pirated version. So I think it's more widely available now. I think if you Google that, Dogen Zen film or something like that, probably some hits will come up.
One question, you're talking about poetry and the volume of his poetry, but you kind of deferred on quality. And given that Kawabata quoted Dogen poem at the beginning of his Nobel Prize acceptance speech, can you say anything about, as poetry, the Chinese kanji or the Japanese waka, the quality of Dogen as a poet?
Yeah. I thought about that a lot over the years, and again, on the Chinese side, the fact that he can play the rhyming game as well as he seems to be able to do, and this was analyzed by Hata Egyoku, who was a former abbot at Eiheiji a few years ago, and I'm looking into that further in my research. That in itself speaks to a certain kind of quality issue because it seems mechanical, but it seems like something you have to know inside and out and demonstrate a kind of mastery. I think the big issue here is that the Japanese academic world, if anything, is more highly specialized than the American academic world. So here we have, a philosophy department, a religious studies department, a literature department, and so forth and so on. What happens in Japan is that his poetry hasn't been taken that seriously in the Buddhist studies world because of the famous sayings, hey, poetry is worthless. So the tradition has not put too much emphasis on it. It wasn't until Kawabata's lecture that there was not a flood of books, but a trickle of books came out in Japan over the years about the poetry. And then if you look at Japanese literary studies, there are vast collections of both Zen poetry written in Chinese by Zen monks who are trying to emulate the Chinese pattern. And I think what you see is that from the year 1200, Dogen was one of the first to go to China, through 1300 and 1400, the further they got away from the history and direct contact with China, the less they were able to follow the rhyming schemes. Like Muso's poem, you won't find him following the technical rules, although it looks like it is, because it's got 4 lines of 7 characters. But the literary scholars in Japan have never looked at Dogen as a literary figure. Probably they still weren't, and it's kind of I would defer to them if they wanted to say, hey, make a comment on the quality. Not that we have to accept it on face value what they would say, but so it's very, very difficult to judge. I think the best we can do is try to translate it. Obviously, you guys have your translations in the Dogen's extended record, and kind of let it speak for itself, and the judgment will probably come out over the years as it becomes more disseminated. Yes?
I know the time periods are very, very way off from each other, but in readings from poetry like Verse of B. Shelley and Lord Byron, I know this imagery of the seasons are used to describe like circularities. I was wondering if you could connect the mentioning of the seasons in the poem Original Face to like a circularity of his philosophies.
I think so. And I thought you were going to ask me a tougher question about historical connections and whether Romantic poets would have been aware of some of this in poetry or something, which it's hard for me to comment on. But yes, I mean, exactly, circularity, I think is the simple but important idea of renewal, that, you know, the spring is going to come again. That's why the plum blossoms are so important. You know, in one of my writings, I counted up the number of references to plum blossoms in poetry or in sermons, and especially in the later years of Dogen's life. Well, Albany AG, very snowy, and I think, you know, to break through from that snowstorm and see the first plum blossom was probably a very exciting event back then, so that's one take on it. But I think as Dogen struggled, you know, he has the sense of struggling with these obstacles that he's facing, the plum blossom imagery becomes very important. In a couple of chapters of Shobogenzo where he quotes Ruging most extensively, and the pinyon rice cake is mentioned earlier as one of the chapters, you'll look back on that and you'll see there's plum blossom imagery all over the place in Ruging's poems and in what Dogen did. They didn't invent it. Wang Wei, famous Tang era poet, several centuries earlier, probably made the plum blossom famous in imagery. But yeah, one other point about the circularity is I like to compare three things. The first one is Dogen's poem Original Phase. The second one is Account of My Hut by Chome, who was a Buddhist literary figure, became a recluse, followed Pure Land Buddhism just around the same time as Dogen in the early 1200s. And he uses the seasonal imagery almost identically, but a little bit different because he comments on it more from a Pure Land Buddhist standpoint. But if you look at that essay, Account of My Hut, and many English translations, wonderful essay, and you'll see towards about 80% into it, so near the end, you'll see a paragraph on the seasonal imagery, very similar to Dogen. And the third one is Kenko, Essays in Idleness is the title that's given, Zule Gusa in Japanese, by Kenko a century later, another Buddhist literary figure, where there's about 100 and some anecdotes. Donald Keene has a famous translation of it, and you see in one of those, he uses that, you know, the four-season imagery, again a little bit differently, but similar to Dogen. So that was the ethos of the time, I think. And Dogen wasn't unique, but each version of it for each of these authors has a slightly different nuance. Yeah.
Does Dogen ever explicitly discuss writing as practice, or discuss his own, or reflect on his own writing as practice?
Yeah, and I think you know, there are a number of passages. The one I quoted here from Zui Monkey is the one that's kind of trotted out regularly and says, well, Dogen must not have cared about it. But that's from a certain context. It was relatively early in his career, around 1236, 1235 and 1236. It was before he was writing a lot of the Shobogenzo essays, and it was and this was instruction that he was giving to a certain group of monks that apparently had come to him from the so-called Daruma school that had been knocked out of, that had been prohibited by the Japanese government, partly because they said that that school wasn't following the precepts. And so Dogen's lectures to that group of monks wanted to be kind of, have that very strict puritanical side. And I think that's why you see there's a couple of passages that sound similar. I think the one that kind of goes in the opposite direction the most fully is San Sui Kyo, Mountains, Rivers, Sutras, one of the chapters in Shobogenzo, where he talks explicitly about koans, where he contrasts his approach with Dahui's approach that, as Griff Folk was talking about. And in that fascicle, and another one, Entangling Vines, Kato is the Japanese title, Entangling Vines, where an image like Kato, in the way it was often used, was mean, don't use words because there's an entanglement, there's a snare, there's a pitfall, they'll drag you down. And Dogen says, no, you only get enlightened through disentangling vines, through the vines, the ongoing language that Griff talked about. So I think he was self-reflective on it. I mean, the problem with somebody like Dogen is, and you know, one of the other contradictions is that the modern Kyoto School of Philosophy likes to say, hey, Dogen was one of the first great Japanese philosophers, and that may be true, but you know, there's no systematic approach in his writing. So you have to look at this, which kind of sermon or essay it was, when he wrote it, what was the audience that he wrote it for, what else might contradict it, and put together that whole package. And all the translation work that these other gentlemen are doing, makes that a lot easier for all of us. Yes?
Maybe it was said before, but why did he actually go to China? Did some monk send him, or did he go for his own interest? I mean, since it was too restrictive at the time for monk and people to live Japan.
Yeah, that's right. That's one of the interesting things. China, Japan and China had a big give and take relationship, and for various reasons, Japanese monks who had traveled to China quite extensively in the early 800s. Kukai and Saicho are the most famous examples. But there was a suppression of Buddhism and other foreign religions in China in the 840s, which a famous Japanese monk happened to be there at the time and in, and his journals of it are part of the record that we have of that experience. But for a long time after that, travel by the Japanese Buddhists to China wasn't happening. Eisai, they say, was the first to travel in the late 1100s to China, and he went there to become a Tendai, to follow the Tendai school. When he got there, he realized that school had pretty much died out, and Zen was what was happening, and he brought back Zen. And then Dogen may or may not have actually met Eisai, but he did study at Eisai's temple in Kyoto, Keninji, and Eisai's disciple Myozen apparently went with Dogen on this trip, and there may have been one or two other followers. There was a new interest. Zen was part of the interest, and the Hojo, the new shogunate, was beginning to encourage interaction now for the first time. So there's a lot of the restrictions were lifted. However, in terms of Buddhism, you needed to have what they call the Hinayana and the Mahayana precepts to get proper papers, to get your visa, so to speak, into China. Myozen had them because he had gone to the city of Nara to get the Hinayana precepts. Dogen did not, and that delayed him. One of the interesting comments that one of the Japanese scholars has made is that when Dogen got to China, he was late on the ship probably because of this paperwork issue, and he didn't have and then eventually he gets accepted and he goes in. And they probably would have arrived in the 4th month, and so shortly after they arrived, the summer retreat, which is pretty severe training period, would have been taking place. Myozen got in right away. He had the precepts, he got into that first summer retreat. Dogen didn't. He hung out on the ship, he talked to people, he had the famous story with the chef, the mushrooms, if you're familiar with that, and so forth and so on, and he hung out. Well, for that summer. Myozen dies shortly after that. According to this one theory, maybe it's a little far-fetched, but Myozen suffered because he had to go right into that retreat. It was too overwhelming for him. It stressed him out. And Dogen, by hanging out, was able to kind of see things more flexibly, wasn't put in that immediately stressful situation, and was able to take advantage of the situation and get the enlightenment experience. So that would have been in the 1220s. After that, monks started going pretty regularly. One of the famous ones was a monk named Eni Benin, who spent 6 years in China. And when he came back, he had a very big temple built for a new Zen temple built for him just up the road from Dogen's temple. That temple, Tofukuchi Temple, is still one of the well-known temples. And so one of the theories is that because of Eni Benin having this big temple, Dogen having a temple kind of dwarfed by the size and the capacity of the new Zen temple, that's when he felt a little bit depressed about what was going to happen to him in Kyoto, and took off for the mountains where he could kind of do his own thing a little bit better. Okay, one more. Yes?